Hey guys, tonight we wander back into a world where people built things with the confidence of someone saying, "This is just temporary," and then accidentally invented centuries of inconvenience. Imagine damp stone walls, half-finished towers, tax collectors with ink-stained fingers, and villagers absolutely convinced that next year would be calmer. It never was. Medieval Europe had a habit of improvising solutions to short-term chaos, wars, plagues, awkward power grabs, and then just keeping them, like emotional baggage, but architectural. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's awake with me in the dark, contemplating humanity's long history of "this'll do for now." Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It began, as many long-lasting mistakes did, with walls. In the early medieval centuries, towns had thrown up wooden palisades in moments of panic, usually after some armored stranger rode in, set fire to a barn, and left with the silver spoons. These fortifications were never meant to be permanent. They were emergency boundaries, splintered ribs of oak hammered into mud with the frantic energy of people who had just learned that raiding was a seasonal sport. The smell of fresh sap clung to the air, and the villagers comforted themselves with the idea that once the political weather improved, and surely it would improve, they could tear the ugly things down. Except the political weather did not improve. It doubled down. Raiders returned, lords quarreled, kings died inconveniently, so the wood was replaced with stone, because if one was going to live in anxiety, one might as well commit architecturally. Stone walls rose heavier and taller, gray and humorless, casting long afternoon shadows over market stalls that had once basked in open sunlight. Gates that were meant to swing freely became choke points where taxes were collected with theatrical sighs. Guards lounged above the arches, pretending vigilance while mostly judging passers-by. The townspeople adapted. They built houses closer together, streets narrower, everything slightly claustrophobic, as though urban planning had been done by someone afraid of open space. Generations were born who had never seen their town without walls, and what had started as a temporary shield against chaos hardened into identity. Being inside meant safety, belonging, and also the faint smell of everyone's cooking trapped together. Being outside meant uncertainty and mud. Eventually, charters were granted, freedoms negotiated, all within the shadow of defenses that had been erected in haste. The walls shaped trade routes, politics, even gossip patterns. News entered through the gates and spread like spilled ale. And so the first of many medieval just-for-now solutions calcified into permanence, because dismantling a symbol of survival required a level of optimism nobody quite trusted. The stones remained, cool and stubborn, long after the original fear had faded into legend, proving that nothing outlived its welcome quite like a structure built in a hurry. If walls defined the edges of a town, castles squatted at its heart like overconfident paperweights, originally justified as temporary military headquarters, and then, somehow, eternal. In the chaotic centuries after empires fractured and everyone with a horse decided they were management, local lords had needed quick strongholds. The first castles were wooden Motte and Bailey setups perched on artificial mounds of earth that looked suspiciously like oversized anthills. They were not designed for elegance. They were designed for surviving Tuesday. Timber towers creaked in the wind, and the freshly dug ditches smelled like damp soil in panic. Lords assured their peasants that once stability returned, a phrase doing heroic levels of delusion, they would scale things back. Stability did not RSVP. Rival claimants kept claiming. So wood turned into stone again, because medieval problem-solving followed a predictable pattern. add rocks. Stone keeps rows square and stubborn, windows narrow as grudges, walls thick enough to absorb both arrows and criticism. What had begun as emergency bunkers evolved into status symbols, because of course they did. Nothing said, "I am temporarily in charge," like a permanent fortress visible for miles. The irony was almost artistic. Inside, halls expanded, tapestries multiplied, and the draft situation remained tragic. Fireplaces tried their best. Smoke drifted sideways anyway. Servants scurried through corridors that had once been defensive walkways. The Lord's family posed beneath banners, pretending the whole arrangement was inevitable rather than improvised. Castles anchored feudal relationships, tying peasants to land and land to lineage. Markets clustered near their gates because proximity to power felt safer than distance, even if it also meant higher rents and the occasional dramatic siege. And sieges happened loudly. Trebuchets lobbed stones in slow theatrical arcs, reminding everyone why the place existed in the first place. Yet over generations, the emergency tone softened. Children played in courtyards that had been designed for mustering troops. Weddings filled halls that had once stored grain for blockades. The castle stopped being a response and became a centerpiece. Its silhouette defined horizons, its shadow dictated daily rhythms, and its maintenance devoured resources with the appetite of a spoiled heir. No one dismantled it when threats eased, partly because threats never fully eased, and partly because tearing down one's own monument to authority required humility, an ingredient medieval politics did not stock. So, the temporary stronghold settled into the landscape, heavy and immovable, as if it had always belonged there, even though it had been born from a very specific moment of collective nerves. It endured, not because it was necessary forever, but because once stone ambition took root, it refused to pack up politely. Long before the stone kept acquired stained glass ambitions, there had been scaffolding, miles of it, clinging to the sides of half-finished cathedrals like wooden spiderwebs. These, too, had been meant to be temporary. A bishop announced a grand new church. The townspeople cheered with cautious wallets, and builders began hoisting beams skyward with the optimism of men who genuinely believed they would see the roof completed in their lifetime. Adorable. Construction stretched not for months, but for decades, sometimes centuries, because funding faltered, wars interrupted, plagues politely deleted half the workforce, and architectural tastes evolved mid-project. The scaffolding stayed. It weathered rain, sagged under snow, was patched, replaced, extended. Generations of carpenters were born into the assumption that the skyline simply included wooden ribs hugging sacred stone. Children grew up thinking heaven itself required maintenance. Inside, worshippers knelt beneath ceilings that were technically still under revision. Dust drifted through shafts of colored light, settling onto prayer books, as if even holiness needed a pause button. The original plan had been straightforward. Erect a house worthy of God, remove the support beams, admire the symmetry, done. Instead, the structure existed in a permanent state of becoming, a holy work in progress with commitment issues. Buttresses were added to fix earlier miscalculations. Towers were raised higher because someone in the 15th century decided higher equaled holier, as if altitude bribed divinity. The town paid indulgences, taxes, donations, whatever polite term disguised the fact that stone was expensive, and salvation apparently came with a construction fee. Markets thrived around the site, selling food to laborers and souvenirs to pilgrims who wanted proof they had visited a building that might someday be finished. The absurdity settled in quietly. What had begun as a bold, time-bound act of devotion became an inherited obligation. Sons laid stones beside foundations their grandfathers had poured. Master masons signed contracts knowing their bones would rest in the graveyard long before the nave was complete. And yet, no one seriously proposed stopping. To halt construction would imply that the original ambition had overshot reality, and medieval pride did not enjoy that conversation. So the scaffolding remained part of the visual grammar of faith, a reminder that permanence often disguised itself as delay. Even when sections were completed and beams finally removed, other parts demanded attention. A cracked arch here, a planned chapel there. The cathedral was less a finished monument and more a timeline in limestone, each century layering its preferences atop the last. Temporary supports blurred into tradition, and the skyline accepted the sight of wood against stone as normal, because when something lingered long enough, people stopped asking whether it had ever been meant to leave. Bridges, like cathedrals, had the audacity to pretend temporariness and then ghost everyone forever. Early medieval crossings were basically ambitious planks over moody rivers, tossed together because merchants needed to move stuff and armies needed to march without ruining their boots in mud. Timber, of course, was the material of choice, because nothing screams, "I plan to last a century," like wood that rots in rainy weather. Initially, villagers assumed the bridges would be seasonal, repaired after winter floods, and then abandoned if they splintered too badly. But rivers have commitment issues of their own. They meandered, eroded banks, tossed debris, and occasionally chewed entire spans for sport. Planners reacted predictably. Reinforce. Plank became beam. Beam became stone arch, and suddenly what had been a quick crossing became an engineering statement. Stone, once introduced, did not believe in expiration dates. Foundations sank like stubborn teeth into the riverbed. Arches rose in perfect semicircular smugness, and piers anchored firmly enough to survive anything except divine wrath or artillery, neither of which seemed particularly concerned with temporary structures. Local economies adapted. Merchants paid tolls grudgingly while debating if the bridge would ever collapse or if complaining was a lifestyle choice. Bridges became social venues too, because medieval people are nothing if not resourceful. Laundry drying, gossip spreading, street performers shouting over the water. Meanwhile, priests blessed the arches, because why not layer superstition onto permanence? And so generations crossed, rebuilt, reinforced, argued, and occasionally fell in, all on structures that were never supposed to outlive a single mayor. By the time decorative statues were added to commemorate anonymous donors, the original temporary purpose was an ironic footnote, like a forgotten tweet that somehow went viral. The bridge shaped trade routes, property values, and local rivalries, solidifying its place in memory and ledger alike. Its silhouette became familiar enough that travelers timed their journeys by the shadow it cast. Children used its piers as diving platforms, and poets waxed inadvertently about endurance when they meant convenience. The river tolerated this arrangement as long as it got its own seasonal theatrics, floods, ice jams, and occasional, "Hey, let's move that pier," episodes. So the bridge lived, a stubborn middle finger to human expectations of temporariness, teaching townsfolk that once you throw enough stone into chaos, it tends to stick around like a slightly judgmental roommate. Its very presence encouraged settlements to cluster nearby, commerce to flourish, and gossip to multiply, all because a design meant to serve a fleeting need had decided it liked the view and wasn't going anywhere. And like any medieval innovation that overstayed its welcome, it acquired lore, superstition, and a reputation for permanence that outlasted every planner's intention, proving yet again that temporary is basically medieval shorthand for forever. Deal with it. Markets were another accidental form of permanence, starting as flimsy tents and hastily laid boards meant for a week or a festival, and somehow colonizing entire town squares for centuries. Merchants erected stalls with optimism and duct tape levels of ingenuity, certain that next season they'd just pack up and relocate if trade dried up, or the bishop decided they were too loud. Spoiler alert, it never went as planned. Wooden frameworks weathered storms, canvas sagged under sun, and yet people stubbornly rebuilt in the exact same spots, because humans are terrible at admitting mistakes and excellent at routine. Shouts of fresh bread and apples stolen from heaven possibly echoed from dawn to dusk, forming a soundtrack to civic life that no king or plague could silence. Streets warped around these commercial squats like reluctant curators, forcing lanes into narrow, uneven paths, because why plan proper roads when a sausage vendor already claimed the prime real estate? Merchants became semi-permanent fixtures, gossiping, trading, cheating, and somehow establishing what counted as the social ladder in the square. Authorities occasionally tried to enforce rules, demanding taxes or moving people, but inertia was a stronger force than any royal decree. The market tents stayed, patched repeatedly, reinforced with extra planks or ropes, until they resembled hybrid sculptures of commerce and despair. Over decades, temporary stalls transformed into semi-permanent shops, then full-fledged timber and stone buildings. The town map evolved like a stubborn cat, bending around the original market layout rather than forcing it to conform. Festivals, originally short-lived bursts of joy, integrated into the daily rhythm of the market. Because if a space is built to host chaos, chaos will naturally resist eviction. Merchants and customers alike internalized the permanence of their own impermanence, creating unwritten codes about where to set up, how to haggle, and who could claim what corner without sparking a turf war. By the time the marketplace was legally chartered, the temporary idea of tents and stalls was an antique joke, and yet no one laughed. It had grown too serious for humor. The square became a living organism, feeding the town's economy, culture, and petty rivalries, all thanks to the humble notion of, let's just set this up for now. In effect, markets illustrated the medieval pattern perfectly. Temporary solutions rarely fade. They stick, grow, acquire tradition, and eventually dictate how people live, trade, and interact for generations. And anyone walking through the bustling streets, smelling roasted meat and fermented cider, would never guess that this vibrant mess began as a fleeting, optimistic afterthought. Church graveyards, too, started as temporary accommodations, awkwardly carved plots along the edges of villages meant to handle the occasional funeral without fuss. Initially, the plan was simple: dig a hole, bury the unfortunate soul, and move on. But death has a relentless consistency that no medieval planner could outwit. Graves multiplied faster than anyone could track, sometimes overlapping like the worst game of real-life Tetris. Villagers began stacking markers, then stone slabs, then little chapels, all because space ran out faster than etiquette allowed. The church, eager to maintain decorum and moral authority, simply expanded boundaries, leveling fields, absorbing nearby meadows, and occasionally buying out stubborn peasants whose land had inconveniently ended up in the path of eternity. Over generations, the graveyard became labyrinthine, winding, and unintentionally aesthetic, a patchwork of family plots, forgotten headstones, and mossy monuments that no one quite remembered who paid for or why. Children dared each other to tiptoe over graves, while elders muttered about respect, historical continuity, or simply about how youth had no idea what real hard work meant. The smell of damp earth, incense, and decomposing foliage mingled in ways that were equal parts spiritual and honestly gross. The temporary plan, "we'll just handle the next few funerals," evolved into a permanent institution, dictating the town's edge and even influencing where homes and roads could be built. Gravestones became neighborhood markers, genealogical gossip boards, and occasionally canvases for the eccentric artistic whims of masons who clearly had opinions about how eternity should be displayed. When plague struck, the graveyard ballooned overnight, and the clergy, fully expecting divine approval for improvisation, dug mass trenches that were meant to be provisional but ended up reshaping the landscape. Eventually, the cemetery's meandering paths and clustered stones became charmingly historic, because humans have a weird ability to romanticize inconvenience once it's old enough to be Instagrammable. And yet, despite centuries of use, expansion, and accidental landscaping, the temporary intent lingered in every crooked headstone and oversized family vault, a whispered reminder that medieval plans rarely knew their own limits. Roads, the very veins of medieval life, were another tragic comedy of temporary intentions gone rogue. Initially, paths between villages were more like suggestions than infrastructure. Dirt tracks worn by horses, carts, and the occasional wandering goat, assumed to last only until the next rain washed them into chaos. Maintenance was sporadic at best, because honestly, who had the energy to fill potholes when bandits were auditioning for surprise attacks and lords were busy redefining borders every other Tuesday? Villagers shoved stones, branches, and whatever convenient debris into ruts, producing a haphazard patchwork that could technically support travel, if, by support, you meant risk limb loss. Over time, some of these rudimentary trails became trade routes, attracting merchants, pilgrims, and armies, which ironically created a feedback loop. More traffic meant more wear, which meant more temporary fixes, which then somehow hardened into quasi-permanent surfaces. Bridges, fords, and ditches were adjusted, widened, or armored with stones, each solution meant to hold until better plans came along, which never did. Inns popped up at convenient intervals, cottages crept toward road edges, and signage, rudimentary at first, basically "here be nights" warnings, turned into actual milestones that endured for centuries. Roads began to dictate settlement patterns. Towns grew around crossings, crossroads, and ferry points because humans are path of least resistance creatures, literally. And so, a mud track that was temporary became the backbone of regional commerce, military strategy, and gossip networks, shaping how societies evolved, who became rich, and who simply got stuck in the mud forever. Potholes persisted like unpaid debts, ruts became features, and every cartwheel that broke told a story of medieval improvisation, slowly ossifying into tradition. Even when paving finally arrived centuries later, it often traced the exact curves and bumps of those original, accidental choices, honoring the stubborn persistence of impermanent design. People forgot that the first wagons had threatened to collapse bridges, fall into rivers, or drag livestock into ditches, but the pattern of "fix now, ignore later" had etched itself into the landscape. By the time maps were drawn and kingdoms formalized, these roads, with their arbitrary meanders and occasional terrifying mudholes, had acquired the dignity of inevitability, proving once again that medieval temporary fixes had a strange tendency to outlive their creators, stubbornly reminding anyone who traveled them that human plans are basically polite suggestions to chaos. Bridges, castles, markets, graveyards, and roads all had a habit of overstaying their welcome. But fences were the unsung champions of medieval permanence despite their humble beginnings. At first, they were simple deterrents, designed to keep wandering pigs out of crops and nosy neighbors from wandering too close to someone's dubious livestock dealings. They were stakes in the ground, tied together with twine or rope, easily dismantled if a neighbor complained, or if the landowner got bored. But humans being humans, they forgot to dismantle them, And pigs, being pigs, they remembered exactly how to exploit any gap. So fences were reinforced with planks, then stones, then more planks, and occasionally with thorny hedges that looked like nature's way of saying, "Good luck, buddy." What began as a temporary solution for controlling chaos became a patchwork of legal boundaries, neighborly grudges, and ornamental stubbornness. Villagers relied on them to define property lines, even if the original dispute had been forgotten, because who wants to risk another screaming match over cabbages? Hedges grew tall, stakes rotted, and new fences were added to repair or extend the old ones. Over decades, fences became invisible regulators of social order, their original purpose, a quick solution for wandering animals lost to history. Some were decorative, some were purely functional, and some existed only to demonstrate that someone had the authority to tell you where to walk. Cows, sheep, and goats slowly adapted to their new lives within these enclosures, and children learned which fences were climbable, which were electric in theory, but never actually electrified, and which simply hid embarrassing garden gnomes. Towns began mapping property according to these stubborn markers, and courts referenced them in disputes because, by now, they were the law as much as the law itself. The irony was thick. Something built to be dismantled weekly or seasonally became a legal, social, and aesthetic fixture, a quiet monument to procrastination and overcautious planning. These fences dictated movement, privacy, and even fashion, because yes, if your neighbor had a thorn hedge taller than yours, your social status subtly dropped. And in a medieval world obsessed with appearances, that was basically the same as a public humiliation. So what had started as a throwaway solution for controlling livestock became a defining feature of the landscape, quietly reminding everyone that temporary fixes often linger longer than anyone expects, silently shaping lives, land, and occasional arguments for generations to come. Ditches, surprisingly, earned a reputation similar to fences, except with a flair for dramatic permanence. Initially dug hastily around towns, castles, or fields as a defensive or drainage measure, they were supposed to be quick fixes. Dig a hole, divert some water, stop the occasional marauder from casually strolling in. Done. But humans, with their talent for optimism, assumed someone would maintain them, refill them, or at least remember their original purpose. Spoiler, nobody did. Rain, runoff, and sheer apathy transformed shallow trenches into boggy, sometimes treacherous swamps. What had been a functional moat or drainage ditch developed its own ecosystem: reeds, frogs, unsuspecting livestock, and the occasional body, because medieval record-keeping was not exactly rigorous. Villagers, initially horrified by the expanding mud, adapted. Stepping stones, rudimentary bridges, or detours became routine. Over time, these ditches dictated traffic patterns, forced roads to curve like reluctant serpents, and influenced where houses, markets, or even graveyards could be positioned. Local engineers, by which I mean whoever wasn't busy and had a spade, patched one section, ignored another, and the whole system became an unplanned labyrinth of water, mud, and awkward social negotiation. Ditches were occasionally lined with stones or timber, sometimes turned into canals for mill power or irrigation, but the original temporary trench vibe persisted invisibly, a permanent ghost of a fleeting decision. Generations grew up navigating them, learning which sections were safe, which were a seasonal nightmare, and which were rumored to be haunted by someone unfortunate enough to have fallen in. And naturally, legends grew. Some said a ditch near the town square had been cursed because a lord's enemy had slipped in and drowned. Others swore it was holy, channeling divine water to keep weeds in check. Regardless, The landscape bent itself around these accidental features, proving once again that medieval temporary measures, when left unchecked, didn't just linger, they shaped life itself. People ceased asking why ditches were there. They simply became landmarks, teaching, threatening, and regulating behavior without ever intending to. By the time drainage systems modernized or rivers were redirected, these ditches, stubbornly, were already part of the town's DNA, proving that when medieval planners said just a quick fix, what they really meant was something that future generations will trip over and swear is ancient wisdom. Watchtowers, perched on hills, river bends, and any conveniently dramatic elevation, started out as emergency lookouts, intended to report marauders, fires, or the occasional rebellious neighbor. Their original function was simple: pop up a quick wooden tower, assign someone who could tolerate boredom for hours, and dismantle it once the threat passed. Naturally, none of that happened. Once erected, these towers developed a stubborn personality of their own. Wood rotted, reinforce, enemy attacked, fortify. Some were replaced with stone, because medieval brains were apparently incapable of imagining that a temporary structure could ever, go away. Once stone arrived, so did permanence. They cast shadows over fields, rivers, and towns, silently asserting, "I am always watching." And soon villagers started orienting their routines around them, farmers timing plowing with the guard's bell, traders avoiding suspiciously moody slopes, and teenagers inventing daredevil stunts at the base just to test fate. The towers became landmarks, legal boundaries, and occasionally storage facilities for supplies no one knew what to do with. They accumulated graffiti, repairs, and eccentric architectural experiments like crenellations that nobody could reasonably justify. Sometimes a lonely watchtower even became a hermitage, because why not repurpose a structure nobody dared remove? Generations passed, and the original purpose, quick warning, faded into legend. The landscape itself adapted to their permanence, with roads curving to accommodate sightlines, villages clustering within the reassuring gaze of these vigilant monoliths, and stories circulating about ghosts, bandits, and heroic defenses. By the time these towers were photographed, painted, or sketched, the world had forgotten that they were supposed to be temporary, and anyone trying to remove one would have faced a collective existential crisis. How dare you erase a centuries-old spectator of human folly? Watchtowers embodied medieval practicality and procrastination simultaneously, built in haste for a fleeting need, fortified endlessly, and ultimately embraced by communities as necessary fixtures of identity, security, and occasional aesthetic judgment. Their stubborn longevity proved, once again, that temporary solutions in the Middle Ages were basically medieval way of saying, eternal, deal with it, and try not to trip on the rubble. Bridges, markets, castles, and even watchtowers aside, temporary signage and boundary markers quietly became the medieval version of forever decorations nobody asked for. Initial posts, simple wooden stakes with a hastily nailed plank or a painted symbol, were intended to mark property lines, dangerous cliffs, or freshly dug ditches for a season or two. Yet, as with all things medieval, they refused to leave. Stakes rotted, signs leaned drunkenly in every direction, and yet someone, somewhere, always replaced them or reinforced them with a stubborn optimism bordering on denial. Artisans began carving intricate symbols into wood or stone, elevating a practical marker into something that vaguely resembled art, as if permanence could be magically imposed through effort alone. Over time, markers dictated behavior. Travelers knew where not to wander. Peasants knew whose sheep were whose, and tax collectors used them as reference points for creative interpretations of obligations. Some markers became cultural icons, inspiring superstition, local disputes, and more than one brawl over territory, because humans are allergic to invisible lines. Generations forgot the original reason the posts existed. The landscape absorbed them, shaping everything from road layouts to grazing rights, and eventually they were incorporated into official maps, legal records, and ceremonial processions. Children grew up navigating by crooked stakes, bending around them in games, or using them as hiding spots during hide and seek, never realizing they were still operating within an architectural footnote meant to be temporary. In essence, these minor, supposedly ephemeral objects demonstrated the medieval pattern with almost smug precision. Quick solutions rarely vanish, evolve into rules, and stubbornly influence social structures long after their practical utility expired. Even when new markers were introduced, the old ones lingered, creating layers of history visible in bent wood, cracked paint, and stone erosion. What started as a fleeting suggestion on where to walk or dig morphed into permanent cartography, folklore, and social regulation, cementing the idea that medieval humans had little faith in the concept of expiration dates. Every marker told a story of improvisation, survival, and unexpected commitment, quietly shaping human behavior across generations and proving once again that temporary medieval plans were basically eternal by default. Finally, temporary festivals and fairs illustrated the same stubborn refusal to disappear, a social counterpart to all the physical fixes that lingered for centuries. What had begun as a week-long celebration of harvest, Saint's Day, or royal visit was intended to provide a quick outlet for commerce, entertainment, and communal joy, then vanish into normal life. Yet the logistics of booths, performance spaces, and makeshift stages had a way of entrenching themselves. A merchant might set up a tent to sell spiced bread for one festival, then next year return with a slightly sturdier frame, and the year after that a semi-permanent timber stall. Minstrels and acrobats pitched corners into spaces that became semi-fixed performance areas, rehearsing tricks that required familiarity with the terrain. Townsfolk began planning their yearly routines around the event, aligning labor, markets, and religious observances to accommodate the commotion. Temporary roads, paths, and bridges were reinforced to handle the surge of wagons and livestock. What was meant to last days gradually defined the annual rhythm of entire communities. Over decades, fairs developed permanent infrastructure, storage rooms, guest quarters, cobbled lanes, and water access, all initially justified as conveniences for the short-term event. Legal charters were granted, taxes formalized, and the festival's influence seeped into civic identity. Children grew up thinking the fair had always existed, and adults planned marriages, business deals, and gossip circuits around it, while historians later marveled at how a fleeting celebration dictated urban planning and social hierarchy. These festivals became anchors in time, intangible yet tangible, shaping memory, expectation, and landscape. And much like walls, castles, cathedrals, bridges, roads, fences, ditches, watchtowers, and markers, the temporary structure of the festival hardened into tradition. Its ephemerality had been an illusion. Permanence was the unexpected gift of continuity, reinforced by repetition and necessity, cementing the medieval pattern of improvisation mutating into long-lasting reality. By the time the tents were reinforced with beams, the stages adorned with carvings, and the merchant stalls permanently braced, the original intent to enjoy a fleeting celebration was laughably overshadowed by centuries of embedded social and architectural habit. In the end, Medieval Europe was a gallery of temporary fixes that stubbornly outlived their creators, teaching the timeless lesson that what humans label just for now has a very bad habit of sticking around. In the middle of Europe's recurring nightmare, when the plague kept reappearing like a sequel nobody asked for, the figure of the plague doctor emerged with the subtlety of a jump scare. Long black robe, gloves, boots, and that legendary bird mask that looked as if a raven had decided to pursue medicine. He had not begun as a symbol of horror. He had been hired help, technically a physician, though physician in the 17th century often meant a person with confidence and access to herbs. The beaked mask had been stuffed with fragrant plants, rosemary, lavender, cloves, because the prevailing theory insisted that disease traveled through bad air, or miasma, which was medieval science's way of saying, something smells off, therefore we are doomed. It made a certain sense to them. Cities had reeked, sewage had strolled openly through streets, rot had been practically decorative. So when people began collapsing with swollen buboes and fevers that burned like punishment, blaming the air felt logical enough. The mask's glass eye holes had stared blankly at the suffering, giving the doctor an insect-like detachment, while the curved beak acted as a portable potpourri chamber against death itself. Observers had later joked, darkly of course, that it looked like a carnival costume designed by someone who misunderstood both birds and humans. But in its time, it had represented protection, or at least the hope of it. The full ensemble had been waxed to repel infection, because oily fabric seemed scientifically promising. A wooden cane had completed the look, allowing the doctor to poke patients from a distance, which was both practical and emotionally distant in a way modern people would call boundaries. Beneath the outfit, the person wearing it had often been young, underqualified, and very aware that mortality rates were not trending in their favor. Still, cities had paid them, sometimes well, to document the dying, attempt treatments, and offer the illusion that someone was in charge. And that illusion had mattered, because when entire neighborhoods had started to empty out, when church bells had rung so often they felt like background noise, a tall figure in a beak mask walking steadily through contaminated streets had signaled at least this: someone had shown up. It had not meant salvation. It had not meant cure. It had mostly meant persistence. The mask had filtered scent more than sickness, but psychologically it had filtered panic. People had seen structure in the silhouette, a system in the straps and buckles. The plague doctor had therefore stood at the strange intersection of fear and theater, medicine and mythology, practicality and almost absurd design. And in that uneasy blend, the legend of the beak had quietly begun. By the time plague outbreaks rolled back through Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, cities had reached a particular stage of desperation that could only be described as hire whoever looks brave. Municipal councils in places like Venice and Paris had drafted contracts for plague doctors with alarming speed, as if onboarding paperwork might slow the apocalypse. These agreements had spelled out duties with bureaucratic calm: visit the infected, record deaths, attempt treatments, avoid stealing belongings from corpses if possible. The fact that this had to be written down said a lot. Many of the men who accepted these roles had been second-tier physicians, recent graduates, or even individuals with minimal training who saw opportunity where others saw mass graves. Established doctors had often fled at the first cough. The beak wearers had stayed because they had fewer options or greater ambition. The outfit, though now iconic, had not been universal at first. It had gradually standardized, especially after the French physician Charles Delorme described a protective costume in the early 1600s that sounded suspiciously like the final goth bird ensemble. His design had included a long coat coated in wax, gloves, boots, and the infamous beak mask packed with aromatic substances. The logic had remained loyal to miasma theory. If the air carried death, then one must domesticate the air. Citizens had watched these figures stride through quarantine districts and understandably felt conflicted. On one hand, the silhouette suggested official action. On the other, it looked like a haunted scarecrow had gained medical credentials. Children had cried. Adults had crossed themselves. Some had whispered that the doctors resembled death more than healers, a walking omen in leather and glass. Yet cities had relied on them to enforce quarantine rules, supervise the isolation of households, and sometimes even certify wills. That last duty had been particularly grim. The plague doctor had often doubled as notary to the dying. Payment had varied. Some contracts promised generous salaries, hazard pay, centuries before the phrase existed, though collection of that pay had depended on survival. It had been gig work in the worst possible market. Still, the presence of a designated plague doctor had created a sense of structure in chaos. Even if the cure rate had hovered somewhere between disappointing and non-existent, administration itself had felt like control. The beaked physician had thus become less a miracle worker and more a municipal symbol, proof that leadership had not entirely dissolved. It had been governance in costume form, oddly theatrical, yet deeply practical. A reminder that when societies panicked, they often dressed their fear in leather, handed it a cane, and called it public health. The intellectual engine behind the beak, dramatic as it looked, had been miasma theory, which had insisted with unwavering confidence that disease floated through the air in poisonous vapors released by rot, swamps, or general bad vibes. This idea had not been fringe. It had dominated European medical thinking for centuries, inherited from ancient authorities like Hippocrates, and reinforced by the towering influence of Galen. If something smelled foul, it was assumed to be dangerous. Frankly, considering medieval sanitation, that had not been the worst guess humanity ever made. Streets had functioned as open drains, livestock had wandered casually through marketplaces, and waste disposal had relied heavily on gravity and hope. When the plague erupted in the 14th century and later revisited with stubborn regularity, people had needed a theory that felt tangible. Air was tangible. Smell was tangible. Invisible bacteria, however, had not yet RSVP'd to human understanding. So physicians had recommended burning herbs, carrying posies of flowers, firing cannons to disperse contaminated atmosphere, and sealing themselves inside scented fortresses of fabric. The plague doctor's beak had been a portable air freshener with ambition. Inside it, mixtures of lavender, mint, camphor, and vinegar-soaked sponges had attempted to sweeten inhaled breath, transforming each step into a walking aromatherapy session against catastrophe. There had been a tragic poetry to it. While microscopic Yersinia pestis bacteria traveled via fleas on rats, doctors had battled fragrance with fragrance. The mismatch had been almost cinematic. Still, miasma theory had offered psychological coherence. It had explained why outbreaks worsened in crowded, foul-smelling districts. It had justified quarantine and isolation, which accidentally sometimes worked. In that way, flawed reasoning had occasionally produced effective policy. That irony had lingered. Even as the Renaissance unfolded and scientific curiosity sharpened, the air remained suspect. People had sealed windows, carried perfumes, and viewed foul odors as omens. The beak mask therefore symbolized not ignorance alone, but a transitional stage in medicine, a moment when observation and superstition coexisted without embarrassment. Doctors had genuinely believed they were filtering corruption itself. And perhaps, in a metaphorical sense, they had been. They filtered panic, imposed ritual, gave citizens something visible to trust. Science had not yet located germs, but it had located fear and attempted to manage it. The beak, absurd and haunting, had stood as a monument to that attempt, proof that human beings would rather invent elaborate scent-based armor than admit they did not know what stalked them. If the plague doctor had walked into a modern fashion week, critics might have called it apocalyptic chic, but in its own century the outfit had been marketed as pure practicality. The long overcoat, usually made of heavy canvas or leather and coated in wax or oil, had been designed to prevent contaminated air from clinging to fabric. The logic had been simple. Slick surfaces were harder for corruption to grip. Whether bacteria cared about fabric texture had not yet entered the chat. Gloves had sealed the hands. Boots had climbed high up the leg. The mask, with its curved beak and glass eye openings, had completed the transformation from human physician to ominous silhouette. When fully assembled, the ensemble had concealed every inch of skin, turning the wearer into something almost anonymous. That anonymity had mattered. It had shielded the doctor from recognition, but also from emotional proximity. Patients had not seen a neighbor or a familiar face. They had seen an institution wrapped in dark cloth and resolve. The cane, often carried as both pointer and probe, had allowed distance. It had been used to lift blankets, examine buboes, or gently nudge the ill without direct contact. In crowded alleys where infection lingered, space had equaled survival. From a design standpoint, the outfit had functioned as early personal protective equipment centuries before laboratories formalized such concepts. Of course, it had not been airtight. Seams had gaped, air had slipped through, yet the intention had been unmistakably modern: create a barrier between caregiver and contagion. Citizens had stared as these figures passed, their wide-brimmed hats casting shadows like portable eclipses. The image had stuck because it had been theatrical without trying to be. Every buckle and strap had whispered seriousness. At the same time, there had been an uncanny absurdity to it. The beak had exaggerated the human profile, stretching it into avian territory, and some observers had joked, quietly, because humor felt risky near death, that doctors resembled crows scavenging the city. Art from the period had leaned into that resemblance, depicting them as half medical, half mythic creatures. Still, the outfit had offered something invaluable, a sense of preparation. Even if the science had wobbled, the commitment had not. Getting dressed in layers of treated fabric had been an act of courage, or at least stubbornness. Each strap tightened had signaled readiness to walk into streets most people fled. The plague doctor had therefore embodied contradiction: protective, yet vulnerable; authoritative, yet uncertain; practical, yet visually surreal. In waxed leather and glass, society had tried to outdress a microscopic enemy, and for a moment that costume had felt like control stitched into cloth. Behind the dramatic silhouette, there had been paperwork, because, even in a catastrophe, someone had insisted on documentation. Plague doctors had not simply wandered in with vibes and a beak. They had signed contracts with city officials who wanted accountability, or at least the appearance of it. In places like Milan and Marseille, agreements had outlined salary, duties, and sometimes even housing arrangements, as if the job were mildly inconvenient rather than lethally risky. Payment had varied wildly. Some doctors had negotiated impressive sums, hazard pay, centuries before corporate HR departments pretended to invent the concept. Others had accepted modest compensation because employment during a plague had been, technically, stable work. The responsibilities had stretched far beyond examining patients. They had recorded the number of infected and deceased, supervised quarantine enforcement, inspected suspected cases, and occasionally testified about causes of death. Essentially, they had been part physician, part statistician, part reluctant detective. The data they gathered had later informed municipal decisions, which meant that beneath the bird mask, someone had been quietly building early public health records. Of course, survival had never been guaranteed. Many plague doctors had contracted the disease themselves. Protective layers had reduced exposure to fleas and bodily fluids, but nothing had offered certainty. The risk had been baked into the role. Established physicians, often wealthier and better connected, had frequently fled outbreaks, retreating to countryside estates. Younger or less prominent practitioners had stepped into the vacuum. Ambition had mingled with bravery. For some, the post had been a career opportunity, a grim ladder to recognition. If they survived, their reputations had risen. If they did not, well, history had moved on quickly. Citizens had responded to these figures with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. A plague doctor entering a home had signaled seriousness. It also meant that neighbors might soon avoid the household entirely. The visit had carried social consequences. Isolation orders had followed assessments, and houses had been marked to indicate infection. The doctor's presence therefore reshaped neighborhoods. Markets had emptied when they appeared. Windows had shut, and yet their arrival had also meant someone was willing to step inside when family members hesitated. That tension defined the profession. They had been both harbingers of bad news and the only structured response available. Through ledgers and long coats, they had imposed order on something that resisted logic. It had not been glamorous medicine. It had been administrative survival in waxed boots. And in a time when chaos had felt endless, even structured exposure had counted as courage, or at least a refusal to completely surrender. Inside the beak, the world had smelled aggressively herbal. The mask had not been an empty prop. It had functioned as a miniature greenhouse of optimism. Physicians had packed the curved chamber with dried flowers, crushed spices, camphor, myrrh, and sometimes vinegar-soaked cloth, creating a dense aromatic barricade against what they believed were toxic vapors. The logic had rested firmly on miasma theory. If disease floated in corrupted air, then purifying the air before it reached the lungs seemed sensible. So the plague doctor had essentially breathed through a sachet. Recipes for these herbal mixtures had circulated like medieval life hacks, passed between practitioners who swore by rosemary or insisted that cloves worked better if slightly toasted. In some cities, apothecaries had done brisk business preparing blends specifically for doctors on duty. The beak's length had not been purely aesthetic. It had created space for the materials to filter and refine incoming air. Glass eye lenses had prevented direct exposure while allowing vision that was probably foggy and claustrophobic. Breathing inside the mask had been warm, humid, and heavy with scent. One could imagine the constant perfume becoming both comforting and nauseating, especially during long shifts among the sick. Beyond the mask, doctors had prescribed treatments that reflected both inherited tradition and creative improvisation. They had recommended bloodletting to balance humors, applied poultices to swollen buboes, and advised patients to avoid certain foods deemed dangerous during outbreaks. Some had burned incense in sick rooms to cleanse the atmosphere. Others had suggested carrying flowers or sponges dipped in vinegar to neutralize contamination. There had even been attempts at quarantine enforcement that, by accident, slowed transmission more effectively than the herbs ever could. Yet certainty had remained elusive. Patients had recovered unpredictably or declined despite every aromatic intervention. The doctor had stood at the bedside, cane in hand, performing rituals that blended science and symbolism. It had not been pure superstition, it had been an honest attempt to interpret limited evidence. Observations about foul-smelling areas correlating with higher illness rates had not been entirely wrong. The missing piece had been microscopic, invisible to every authority of the time. Still, the act of filling the beak had been more than medical procedure. It had been psychological armor. Each sprig of lavender tucked inside had signaled intention. Each whiff of camphor had reassured the wearer that something stood between them and invisible harm. Even if that barrier had been largely symbolic, symbolism had power. Inhaling fragrance while walking through decay had created a small pocket of control in an environment defined by uncertainty. And in that perfumed darkness, hope had lingered, stubborn and scented. The cities themselves had transformed into uneasy stages where silence performed louder than noise. In outbreaks that followed the original 14th century catastrophe, especially after the devastation remembered as the Black Death, urban life had acquired a hollow echo. Markets had thinned, workshops had stalled, church bells had rung so frequently that their sound blurred into a kind of metallic background hum. Streets that once pulsed with trade had felt suspended, as though someone had pressed pause on civilization. In port cities like London and Florence, ships had been quarantined offshore, their crews trapped between sea and suspicion. Flags had signaled infection, guards had monitored gates, households with confirmed illness had been marked, sometimes literally sealed, turning homes into reluctant isolation chambers. Into this altered landscape, the plague doctor had walked with deliberate steadiness. The beaked figure had cut through empty squares and narrow alleys, boots striking cobblestones that seemed to recoil. Windows had cracked open just enough for anxious eyes to follow. Whispers had traveled faster than any official notice. The air itself had felt charged with blame. People had eyed strangers warily, wondering who carried invisible doom. Some had accused marginalized communities, others had turned suspicion inward, interpreting illness as punishment or fate. Meanwhile, municipal authorities had tried to enforce order with regulations about gatherings, burial practices, and sanitation. Mass graves had sometimes replaced individual funerals when numbers overwhelmed ritual. That shift had unsettled even the most pragmatic observers. Death had lost its ceremony, reduced to logistics. The plague doctor had documented these losses in ledgers that balanced names against dates, a grim arithmetic of survival. Yet not everything had been stillness. Infected districts had carried the sounds of coughing, crying, bargaining with heaven. Vendors had occasionally risked selling food through windows to quarantined households, conducting business at arm's length. Life had persisted in fragments. The beak mask, visible from a distance, had signaled that official oversight continued. It had been both reassurance and omen. Children had hidden behind doorframes at its approach. Adults had stiffened, bracing for news. The city's rhythm had adjusted around these visits. Even the weather had seemed suspect. Fog interpreted as contamination, heat blamed for stirring foul vapors. In such an atmosphere, every sensory detail had gained exaggerated meaning. The plague doctor had navigated this charged environment as part healer, part bureaucrat, part symbol. Through empty plazas and shuttered homes, the figure had embodied continuity. Civilization had not entirely collapsed. It had simply narrowed to essentials. And among those essentials had been the steady, unsettling presence of the beak moving through suspicious air. Public reactions to the plague doctor had rarely been neutral. Fear had been the default setting. When a tall, dark-coated figure with a curved beak approached, people had not exactly felt comforted, even if logic told them this was medical assistance. The outfit had amplified emotion. Some citizens had treated the doctor like a necessary evil, someone to tolerate because the alternative was abandonment. Others had viewed the mask as an omen, a visual confirmation that death had officially entered the neighborhood. In marketplaces, conversations had hushed mid-sentence at the sight of the silhouette. Parents had ushered children indoors. There had also been skepticism. Not everyone had trusted the competence of these hired physicians, especially when survival rates remained discouraging. Rumors had circulated that plague doctors exaggerated case numbers for pay, or that they mishandled the sick. In times of crisis, suspicion had flourished faster than bacteria. Satirical pamphlets had occasionally depicted them as grotesque birds, picking at society's remains, exaggerating the beak until it seemed absurdly long. Humor had functioned as coping mechanism. If one could laugh at the mask, perhaps one could shrink the terror behind it. Yet desperation had coexisted with mockery. Families with infected relatives had begged for visits, clinging to any possibility of intervention. The arrival of a plague doctor had meant someone would at least examine symptoms, offer recommendations, and provide official acknowledgement of illness. That acknowledgement had mattered socially and spiritually. Clergy had sometimes coordinated with physicians, blending prayer and procedure in cramped rooms heavy with incense and anxiety. Meanwhile, some communities had reacted violently to perceived mismanagement of outbreaks. Doctors and officials had occasionally faced hostility when quarantine orders disrupted livelihoods. Sealing a house could protect neighbors, but it also trapped residents inside with dwindling supplies. Anger had simmered. In rare instances, plague workers had been attacked, accused of spreading disease rather than containing it. The beak mask, so distinctive, had made anonymity impossible. One could not blend into a crowd while dressed like a midnight heron. Even so, many doctors had continued their rounds. They had developed routines to manage tension, maintaining formal speech, avoiding unnecessary gestures, relying on the authority of municipal backing. Over time, communities had adapted to their presence. The shock had dulled into wary familiarity. The mask had become part of the outbreak's visual language, as recognizable as closed gates or marked doors. In that uneasy normalization, something deeply human had unfolded. People had learned to live beside symbols of mortality. They had gossiped about the doctor's habits, critiqued their methods, even imitated the beak in carnival costumes once outbreaks subsided. Fear had never vanished, but it had blended with irony and resilience, creating a complicated relationship between society and its most theatrical caregivers. As the centuries edged forward and outbreaks eventually loosened their grip, the image of the plague doctor refused to retire quietly. Artists and writers had seized upon the beaked silhouette because it practically demanded attention. In engravings from early modern Europe, the figure had appeared elongated and slightly surreal, half physician, half ominous bird stalking cobblestones. The costume's stark geometry, dark cloak, pale mask, circular glass eyes, translated beautifully into print. It had looked dramatic even in monochrome, which was convenient because printing technology was not exactly bursting with color options. Satirists had leaned into exaggeration. They had stretched the beak to improbable lengths, added exaggerated postures, and framed the doctor as both comic and tragic. In some depictions, the cane had become theatrical, more prop than instrument. Audiences had consumed these images with a mix of fascination and relief. The worst waves of plague had receded, allowing society to look back with that slightly smug hindsight humans loved. memory softened horror just enough to permit caricature. Over time, the plague doctor had slipped into carnival culture, particularly in cities like Venice, where masked festivals already blurred lines between satire and spectacle. The beak had migrated from hospital wards to masquerade balls, shedding its original urgency while retaining its mystique. What had once signaled contagion now suggested theatrical flair. That transformation had been telling. It revealed how societies metabolized trauma, converting fear into aesthetic. Writers had also woven the figure into broader narratives about mortality. The plague doctor had stood as a reminder of humanity's recurring dance with invisible threats. Even when scientific advances began identifying pathogens with precision, the older image lingered in cultural imagination. It had embodied a particular historical mood, earnest effort colliding with limited knowledge. Modern observers, peering back through textbooks and museum displays, often oscillated between amusement and admiration. The costume looked bizarre, yes, but it also represented courage filtered through flawed theory. In contemporary media, the beak mask resurfaced in films, novels, and graphic art as shorthand for eerie medicine or dystopian resilience. It became memeable long before memes had a name, yet beneath the stylized adaptations, a quieter truth persisted. The original wearers had not intended spectacle. They had dressed to survive, to impose order, to breathe slightly less contaminated air. Art had amplified the drama, but history had grounded it in necessity. And so the plague doctor had lingered in collective memory, perched between seriousness and satire, a figure impossible to forget once seen. The beak had become less about herbs and more about symbolism, a visual echo of an era when medicine had worn its uncertainty on its face. The legacy of the beak mask had outlived its immediate usefulness, settling into collective memory with a mixture of reverence, absurdity, and a touch of meme-worthy horror. Museums had displayed waxed coats, glass-eyed masks, and wooden canes as artifacts, often accompanied by captions that attempted to balance explanation with the inevitable, "Yep, they look terrifying" commentary. Historians had debated the efficacy of the costume, largely concluding that while it had offered minimal protection against plague, it had provided psychological armor, both for the wearer and for the public who glimpsed the figure from shuttered windows. In popular culture, the plague doctor had become shorthand for impending doom, mysterious intervention, or surreal medical aesthetics. Halloween had eagerly adopted the silhouette, video games had animated it, and the internet had turned it into emojis of morbidity, proof that humans never outgrow fascination with our own mortality. Scholars had noted the irony. A design meant to preserve life had become a symbol of death, a reminder of the limitations of early science. Yet in that contradiction lay a lesson about resilience and human creativity. For all its oddity, the beak had represented an attempt to impose order in chaos, to fight invisible enemies with whatever tools imagination, observation, and tradition could provide. Even modern public health efforts had echoes of the same principle: prepare, isolate, document, and intervene, though with microscopes and vaccines rather than camphor and wax. The mask had also sparked reflection on aesthetics and fear, illustrating how visual language could influence perception of authority and danger. And while nobody alive had witnessed the original rounds of plague firsthand, the image persisted, hauntingly clear, a leather-clad figure striding through foggy streets, beak stuffed with herbs, cane tapping cobblestones, eyes hidden behind glass, humanity's hope and anxiety embodied in a single silhouette. The plague doctor's beak had survived as an icon precisely because it had been practical and theatrical at once. Generations had laughed at it, feared it, studied it, and recreated it in countless forms, each iteration carrying fragments of the original context alongside the embellishments of memory. In the quiet of historical reflection, the story of these strange, beaked healers offered more than morbidity. It offered insight into human attempts to manage fear with ritual, design, and imagination. The figure had reminded humanity that even in the most absurd appearances, courage could wear a costume, and even in failure, a symbol could endure. The plague doctor had walked through centuries long after the last outbreak, not just as a reminder of death, but as a testament to persistence, creativity, and that strange, unavoidable urge to look terrifying while trying to save lives. In that balance between horror and hope, history had found its own kind of dark poetry, tucked neatly into leather, herbs, and glass.